This is the third program in the series, Barbados' Sea Portal. Hello, I'm Sherwood McCaskey. I'm pleased that you have joined me. In our last program, we continue our look at the state of Barbados' Sea Portal during the 1940s and the 1950s. We listened to some of the debates surrounding the construction of a deepwater harbor and the two proposed schemes. We ended noting the firm decision that was taken by the government, led by Premier Grantley Adams, now national hero, the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Adams, to go ahead with the North Scheme. The first two programs, in a sense, concluded our look at the formative years when this island's main maritime gateway was the Carlisle Bay and the Carinage. Like then Premier and the government, we now move in a northerly direction as we consider the North Scheme, Pelican Island. Under consideration in this program will be the then affluent neighborhoods of Cheapside, Fontebelle and Land's End.
What it did recall is up where the fishing complex is now. Used to be the market, what we would call the old market. And next to that was a driveway we call, I think we used to call it Princess Alice, where there was a lot of, we still have a part down where the Harbour Industrial Park is now. Right, people used to come through there. And all down here was, I would say, a sea, apart from a little island we had out there used to call Pelican Island.
We thought that Pelican Island was kind of magical. And we always had this wish, this dream that somehow we could go across the Pelican Island. And when it was announced that there was going to be a port built to bridge between Pelican Island and Barbados, this was almost frightening, this was upsetting, this was disturbing. People thought, well, Barbados is going to be changed in this very strange way, and there was a lot of controversy about it at that time. But it was recognized that it was a huge advance for Barbados that could possibly bring great economic benefits. So everyone was very happy to see it happen.
Now, we're standing at the entrance of the Bridgetown port. Pelican Island was swallowed up in the construction of the port. Now, exactly what was Pelican Island? Why the name Pelican, and what was it used for?
Well, from time immemorial, Pelican Island, which was about 400 meters, quarter of a mile, the distance from, let's say, CBC to Sky Mall at Haggett Hall. Pelican Island was known for those birds. You know, the doggerel. An unusual bird is the pelican. His beak can hold more than his belly can. The pelican with a very large beak, famed in mythology for its ability to hold a lot of food in its beak and bring it for its children. Indeed, as you know, the pelican is famed for even starving itself in order to feed its children. Consequently, the University of the West Indies adopted the pelican as its bird. So, you know, the university crest contains the picture of the pelican, symbolizing the notion that these islands, which constitute the West Indies and support the University of the West Indies, will go to the lengths of privation to support their young. Right? So it was such an island. It was a nesting place for hordes of pelicans, migratory birds, because Barbados is not the home of the pelican, and they would come and stay on Pelican Island and nestle there, and that went on years, decades, centuries. Then, before the Second World War, a few buildings were put on Pelican Island, and during the Second World War, when Italian captives, when Italian soldiers were captured by the British, they didn't put them in St. Lucia or else, they put them in Barbados, at Pelican Island. So it was a station for holding Italian prisoners. And it had then hospital and other administrative buildings. So it had a mini community, like a convict colony. After the Second World War, you had to decide what to do with these facilities on Pelican Island. And it now was turned into a quarantine station.
The huge introduction of yellow fever into Barbados and things like that, we had a quarantine island. Pelican Island was conveniently located. It was just on the northern end of Carlisle Bay.
And so it continued down into the 50s, and having no particular purpose except to serve as a destination for swimmers like CBC's Mark Williams and other boys from that area.
In low tide, you could walk to Pelican Island. Yeah. In low tide, you had this situation where you could walk from one point if you know where you were going to walk. But if you ever get caught out there in high tide and you can't swim, you're in trouble. But low tide, we don't see any low tide now. Low tide at Brandon one time was about as far as from here down to the bus around the boat. Yeah, low tide. Sea went way back. You could walk and walk and walk and walk and walk. But hopefully, if the sea come in and like, you're on the island, you can't get back unless you come back by the boat.
Who played cricket on the reef which is down there in Fontebelle, where Chefette now is, jumped off from there, where Pelican Village is now. They waded from there out to Pelican Island and swam back when the tide came in. So it was a joy for a lot of Barbadian youngsters, mainly boys, to swim out to Pelican Island.
Every month we would go on a Sunday to Brighton to spend the day at my aunt's house, which was right on the beach. And of course, part of that whole thing was walking the Brighton beach right down to Pelican Island. And we were not considered strong enough swimmers to swim across to Pelican Island. And there was no boat to take us across, so I'd never been on the land at Pelican Island. But it was a kind of magical place that Barbados had an island.
And that is all it stood for. Quarantine station, former prisoner of war station, place to harbor birds, migratory birds, and by the 1950s, not much happening there.
It is important that you get a picture of the state of these areas prior to the construction of the Deepwater Harbor, which resulted in them being joined to Pelican Island. Although they were separated from Pelican Island by water, Cheapside, Fontebelle and Land's End and Pelican Island were in a sense inextricably linked. Let us take a look at what existed in these areas just before the construction of the Deepwater Harbor.
The type of activity that used to take place in Cheapside, which was a kind of residential area, and even in that area, a memory of a man called Webb, who sold cane juice, and in truth and fact, he sold a lot of fish tackles, like fish hooks and that different thing. But if we move down Fontebelle, in the 40s, 50s, there was a percentage of white people living on Fontebelle. You had the Goddards, you had the Cheesemans, while on the other side of Fontebelle you had the New Orleans, Chapman Lane people, and they had to frequent the beach, which ran along the Fontebelle area. The reef was the area where a lot of the people who lived at Chapman Lane and who lived at Lates Folly would go and bathe on the reef.
This area that we are occupying now was not inhabited by the townspeople of town. Bridgetown ended in the immediate Cheapside area. This complete area was a plantation. In fact, sugarcane fields came down almost to the water's edge.
That land was the land of the Kensington plantation, and the Goddard family lived in the old plantation house. There was another plantation house which became the Methodist manse, recently destroyed, unfortunately, that had the most magnificent plaster decorations in Barbados.
Now, over time, especially from the early 19th century, the streetscape of Fontebelle started to change. Merchants of Bridgetown wanted to leave the crowded area of Broad Street. Remember, in the 19th century, many people still actually lived on Broad Street. They lived upstairs and conducted their businesses down below. In my youth, many owners of businesses on Roebuck Street lived upstairs and conducted their businesses downstairs. But from the early 19th century, people then started to shift from the core of Bridgetown, and they moved into what became Fontebelle, what was rechristened Fontebelle, and built houses, substantial houses, on either side of the road.
Fontebelle was the sandy lane of Bridgetown at the turn of the century. When Fontebelle was developed, that was the place that the wealthy people lived between the end of the Victorian era and the early 20th century. And almost every house along Fontebelle was the house of a rich merchant. It began at Cheapside. There were some lovely, beautiful old houses in the Cheapside area. People like Sir Frank Blackman grew up in the Cheapside area. And my wife's godmother lived in a lovely old house just about where the General Post Office is. But as you went north along Fontebelle, the houses became grander and grander and grander.
I can think of a substantial house like Galba Lodge, which stood until relatively recently when it was sold to a business concern and they promptly demolished the entire house. But in the 19th century, Galba Lodge was owned by a Jewish Sephardic family, the Azevedos, who later married into the Daniels family.
You had at the end of the road the wonderful Cosmopolitan Guest House, the house that was demolished in order to get an extra 8 feet for the new Kensington Circle. When Kensington Oval was remodeled for World Cup into a circle, the beautiful house that was run by old Mrs. Hines, the Cosmopolitan Guest House, where Sir Grantley Adams and all of his friends and all of the cricketers in the days when he kept wicket for Barbados, and subsequently that Cosmopolitan Guest House was the place where people gathered. It was a beautiful Georgian house, more than 200 years old, and it was demolished because they planned Kensington badly, and they said they needed an extra 8 feet, and that invaded the back bedroom of that house, so that in spite of the promises to the National Trust that that gorgeous house would not be demolished, it was ruthlessly demolished. Herbert House is the last, therefore, of those wealthy mansions.
Also interesting about that property is that on the seaside, there was a very long jetty leading into the sea with a pavilion at the end of the jetty. And that was, of course, used for mooring. The family had boats that sailed, or later motorized speedboats. And so it was convenient to have that type of jetty arrangement to enable movement from sea to land.
Herbert House was one of the major residences in Fontebelle, but this was the house where T. Herbert lived, so it was known as Herbert House. That had what we call a beach jetty at the back, where we call a tea jetty, where the families would walk out on the jetty on afternoons and probably sit there in the sunset and have tea and that type of thing.
Now, to understand that, you must unlearn all that you now know of this area. This is the back of Herbert House. The tea jetty extended, of course, in a westerly direction looking towards the Pelican Island. In other words, all of this area where I'm standing was sea.
But down in the far end of Fontebelle, before you got to the junction, just outside of Kensington Oval, you had the Fergusons. And you had a Dominican lady by the name of I think her name was Dangle Ben, but she occupied the house right opposite Kensington Oval.
A discussion about the landscape of this area prior to the construction of the Deepwater Harbor is incomplete if we were to ignore what was arguably one of the more aesthetically pleasing mansions that dotted the shorelines across the water from Pelican Island.
Holborn House is one of the great mansions of Barbados. Its historicity is important. It was hugely important. It was thought that the design had something to do with the famous Richard Lygon, whose book of A Short and Exact History of Barbados, published in 1657, after he, a royalist in debt, had fled to Barbados and utilized his tremendous skills, both as a writer, as a historian, as a naturalist, as an artist, perhaps as someone with an understanding of machinery, who could in his book produce a beautifully laid out plan of the ingenuo, which was what they called the sugar boiling house in those days. Ligon is said to have been so impressed by the horrible building of Barbados that he designed houses for his friends, and it was said that Holborn was one of those designed by Colonel Humphrey Waldron, who was one of the big ups of the middle of the 17th century. But it was built within a stone's throw of the sea. And it was determined eventually that it was much too unsafe a place for the governor to live in case Barbados was ever attacked. Because although we had repulsed the Dutch under Admiral de Ruyter very successfully, people felt that there was still a risk of obviously being attacked again, and therefore the governor's house was moved inland in 1702 to Pilgrim, which is the present government house. So Holborn was a magnificent house, a historic house, and a very solidly built house.
Which eventually, in my time, was owned by the Hills. They also had a dairy.
But in their wisdom, it was decided that it should be sold to build oil bunkers. And so we have those magnificent, beautifully aesthetic oil bunkers in the place of the great old Holborn house.
As you move further on, you had going down to the end of Fontebelle before you turn to go up Westbury Road, Westbury New Road. You had on one side, which was the late Captain Ferguson, George Ferguson. His residence was there.
It was a little fishing bay with Mr. Ferguson, and maybe a few other houses was there. But he was one of the main people. In them days, he had fishing boat and big schooner like the William Johnson and those schooners.
Over the years, quite a number of stories were told about the activities that occurred in the Princess Alice Club, notably the dances. Now, if you were to leave the Princess Alice Club and make your way in a northerly direction, chances are you would have come upon the Sand Pit.
The Sand Pit is where the harbour master docked. Inside of that, where the submarine, all that was the Sand Pit. Because away from that was the mooring. Just off the Sand Pit was the mooring. This is where the boats, after fishing, would come in and tie up, and the little Moses would go out to the boats, whether they be the sailboat or the motorboat. And the little Moses that was moored off from morning will then bring in the fish and bring in what was supposed to be taken off the motorboat, the motor launch, or the sailboat, and come right into the Sand Pit. But the boats were moored off the Sand Pit. The thing is still there.
In the early days, when the shake season come in, they used to got shovel all up there. You go up there and pick my shake and see gas and thing. Yeah. But nowadays they don't know see the shake. I don't even see the marsh. You know.
And talk about sea eggs. Oh man, this was a sea egg bear. Sea eggs. And you remember the covers? You went black. You had to stick in your foot. Whenever you see covers, sea eggs. But this was a sea egg. This was a rare fishing bear. Sea eggs. Yeah.
That's how Barbados did. All down there, we used to go in the sea. And we would scope and come all the way down there and pick sea cats till we get down to Paradise. But sometimes you butt up on a layer fish too. I know one day a fella butt up on a layer fish and got all great. Going down there, we had to get the marsh and little stuff like that there. Well, they didn't have the housing area down in the farm at the time either. And we would left all kinds, and we would walk and go down there for the crabs. Because there did the crab place right out in the back there. There used to be a long pipe running from Jenkins right to the wastewater thing from up at Jenkins down there, and there was a river down there. If you get a little above Wisers, little above there, if you would observe now, they still got the entrance to the river that over from that side there, so but it is sand now, cause they had then built a concrete thing, but the river used to come from all the way up Jenkins, all the way down there. Yeah, that's how it was. They used to got these, what they call the wild mangers. All you see from the above part, but you cut the road, the harbour road cut through there, but all of that was mangoes and all them needle trees and stuff like that there.
Let us retrace our steps a few meters and pick up the tour from outside of Captain George Ferguson's house.
And next to George Ferguson, in the latter days, you had Shamrock Allen. Lloyd Allen occupied premises in that area. While on the other side, I remember there was the Cheeseman families, Dawson Cheeseman and those families. This is where Esso has now taken over what was a residential area. Looking up West Virginia Road, this is where, as a youngster, I remember there was a lady selling fish from the sand pit. Would come and be sold at that point, and a lady by the name of Marjorie. Many of the fishermen in the area would occupy that T-junction, where you proceed down Land's End, or you go up Fontebelle, or you go up West Virginia Road. Below that was a house which was owned by Mon, who eventually had the pharmacy in Lower Bay Street, Mon's Pharmacy. This was the house where the Democratic Labour Party was actually formed under the late Cameron Tudor. Below that was a house which Victor Chase, who at one time was a church warden, a member of the vestry, running a business called ML Seal, who knew, in my time, they used to trade in old iron, where they would buy old iron and old copper or lead and would ship. But Victor Seal was a prominent businessman, but they occupied Tudor Street. But the residence was at Land's End, the last property. And Victor Chase, I remember also that he was a racehorse owner, and there were many racehorse boxes that were assembled in the yard during a period of time. Below that then was Land's End.
Land's End, you couldn't go down the Harbour Road like what I got now. When you get to this same road, they tell you when you swing out to the Costain and you make the left and then make back the right, you could just look there and see the end of Barbados. All back there, the bare sea and things.
Up by the RSPC here, that is as far as you could have walked on a little piece of road I had there when you come from Fontebelle. And then to cross down here, they had like a river and some big rocks where you used to go step by these rocks across. They come all down here through Exmouth. All down here was just bush, fruit trees, and you know.
Land's End, that land, the road terminated. There was, I wouldn't actually call it a cliff, but there was about a 15-foot drop or so down onto the beach. And when you went onto that beach and you walked to where the Indian River flowed in to the sea at that point in time, you could look across the water and look towards Pelican Island.
The far end of Land's End was also another T-bridge, which people, residents along before you get to the T-bridge, prominent residents were the Browns, right? And also Captain Evelyn. Captain Evelyn, who was said to be one of the inter-island captains, he lived on that stretch. Further down as we go, then you had the end of Land's End, which will then take you over to what was known as the Indian River. The Indian River, which is now the area of courts. The monument is there. All that area was then known as the Indian River, where there was a river that went into the sea before you move over to what was known then as Exmouth. So I have taken you from Cheapside all the way down, and I brought you to the point of Land's End. I brought you to the point where all of that had been reclaimed.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. We did enjoy the tour with you, along with Harold Burgess, Leroy Robinson, historian Trevor Marshall, and the newly knighted gentleman, Senator Professor Emeritus Sir Henry Fraser. Together, as you shared with us your memories of what dotted the landscape of Fontebelle, Cheapside, and Land's End up until the 1950s, just before the start of the construction of the Deepwater Harbour, when Pelican Island was swallowed up in Barbados, as it were. And so that brings us to the end of this, the third program in the series, Barbados History Portal. As always, I appreciate the fact that you have opted to spend the last 30 minutes with me. Do join us next week at the same time as we continue our look towards the construction of a deepwater harbour for Barbados on this Barbados' Sea Portal. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.